Okay, so it's 80 years since Hayek's Road to Serfdom was released, and I think it remains perhaps the most persuasive analysis of why a planned economy, or a very, very heavily regulated economy, is incompatible with democracy and individual freedom. I think the fact that few people today, even in an environment that has turned, I think, discernibly in the last 15 to 20 years to be more hostile to free market ideas, the fact that very few people are actually arguing for something like comprehensive central economic planning illustrates the power of Hayek's argument. Nonetheless, in my view, individual freedom today is very much under threat. And if we are to understand these threats, we need to update the type of analysis that Hayek puts forward in The Road to Serfdom. And I propose to offer one way of updating that thesis in this presentation. And I propose to do so by drawing on insights from perhaps what you might consider to be an unlikely source, the French social theorist and philosopher Michel Foucault, where Hayek focuses on, if you like, the more dramatic ways in which socialism threatens freedom. Foucault's concepts of discourse power, governmentality, and biopower, I will suggest, can help us to understand how freedom can be curtailed through an almost imperceptible process in which the individual human agent is erased from view. This is what some Foucauldians refer to as a process of government at a distance, or if you like, serfdom at a distance. The processes that underlie this serfdom at a distance, I will suggest, can provide a valuable complement to Hayek's account that is of special relevance to understanding the political moment facing us today. So I'll begin my remarks by giving a brief recap of Hayek's argument in The Road to Serfdom. I'll then introduce the Foucauldian concepts of discourse power, biopower, and governmentality. And then finally, I'll proceed to show how we can use these concepts to understand how multiple roads to serfdom may be unfolding in contemporary liberal societies. So let me start by giving what I see as the core argument, or at least one of the most important arguments in Hayek's Road to Serfdom thesis. I think that thesis is fundamentally linked to his economic theory and his understanding of economic problem of society. In brief, Hayek argues that there is no agreement over the basic economic facts of life. And by that, I mean which goods should be produced, at what price they should be sold, how the goods should be produced, the kind of organizational forms that should be involved in the production process. In a market economy, we deal with that disagreement, that pervasive disagreement, through an impersonal process of competition, a process that generates signals which continually update people's information about which of these ideas are actually working, succeeding, and those that are failing in some sense, through the account of profit and loss. In Hayek's view, a centrally planned economy cannot replicate what a market system does because it doesn't have access to the same gene pool of ideas that you get through a kind of competitive process. But also, a planned economy would have a secondary effect of eliminating democracy and individual freedom. In the absence of a market economy based on private property and the price system, planners simply won't know, in a sense, what to do. There's going to be as many points of view about the kind of economic actions that should take place as there may be people in the society. In these circumstances, even an attempt to create a kind of democratic viewpoint is going to be highly problematic for reasons that were subsequently enunciated by Kenneth Arrow in his impossibility theorem. In these circumstances, you're either going to have no decisions made, or you're going to have a situation where out of the chaos or the vacuum, if you like, which exists when we don't have a market system, a strong man comes along and says, I will bring order out of the chaos. Now, this is the central theme that emerges in what I think is the most important chapter in Hayek's Road to Serfdom. It's called Why the Worst Get on Top. So in a situation where you have disagreement and nobody can do anything, we don't have the market operating to deal with the disagreement, someone comes along and says, I will bring order out of this chaos. Someone who is willing to impose a plan in circumstances where there is disagreement isn't going to be the nicest type of person. There's a selection effect which operates in this environment. And this is what Hayek means by why the worst get on top. They're the people who are willing to impose a view in a situation where there is actually no unified view, where there is radical disagreement. And they'll deploy techniques in these circumstances that deploy those who want to resist the proposed plan as, in some sense, enemies of the people. Now, this argument is targeted primarily at central economic planning or the attempts to very, very heavily regulate a market system. But Hayek also has a version of this argument in his critiques of social justice. So he's not opposed to the welfare state, as Jeremy pointed out. He supports some kind of social insurance mechanism, it seems. But he is opposed to the idea of attempting to regulate the precise gaps between people in terms of a particular patterned outcome. For reasons that Jeremy referred to, well, there's no agreement on precisely what these gaps should be. So the road to serfdom dynamic is going to be replicated in these kind of situations. If we try to empower some actor to impose a pattern in a situation where there is no agreement about what the pattern should be, either you just have democracy operate as a kind of bargaining process, in which case it doesn't make decisions on the basis of any coherent notion of social justice, or you have someone who's willing to come in and say, I will provide the right pattern of distribution. And again, this isn't going to be the nicest kind of person who is willing to operate these kinds of powers. So those are the dynamics that Hayek talks about in The Road to Serfdom. And I think they provide really compelling arguments about the dangers of certain kinds of government action. But I don't think this account is fully adequate to explain the kind of threats to individual freedom that are unfolding in society today. What we see today in our market economies is not the attempt by a Lenin, Stalin, or Mao to impose a fully planned society. Rather, what we see is the spread of a more decentralized form of managerial control that infuses multiple policy domains and locations, and that is almost silently closing down people's freedom of maneuver. Think about the concerns that many people express around freedom of expression and what some people refer to as cancel culture. Think about the difficulties that there are in having plural and open conversations about issues such as public health, equality, inclusion and diversity, and environmental social governance in this regard. To understand the character of these new roads to serfdom, I think it may help to turn to the work of the French social theorist Michel Foucault. Foucault makes a distinction between three types of power. The first type of power he refers to is what he calls sovereign power. This is the kind of power you would associate with the capacity to command other people, to tell them directly what to do. It could also be involved in the king's right to execute someone who's an enemy of the regime. So it's power exercised through direct commands. The second type of power he talks about is the kind of power that can be transferred from one act to another. It's the kind of power that operates through wealth, for example. So you transfer a piece of wealth to another actor when you engage in some kind of economic transaction. The third type of power he identifies, which he thinks is, if you like, one that is being neglected by many thinkers, is a decentered form of power, which operates through a web-like series of interactions within the context of what Foucault refers to as discourses. Crucially, these discourses are not controlled by any particular individual, actor, or group. Discourses are narrative frames or interpretive grids through which people come to understand and experience themselves and the world around them. And they affect what are considered as acceptable statements in a society. In Foucault's view, freedom can be threatened in an insidious way through the power of discourse and its alignment with other forms of power, because it may work silently to lock people into relationships and forms of understanding that limit their freedom and capacity for self-governance. Discourse is inevitable in society and does not itself threaten freedom of agency, but it may become threatening when any one discourse or set of discourses achieves a kind of cultural monopoly power that curtails pluralism of thought and action and limits freedom of maneuver. Foucault has a term for this kind of cultural monopoly, which he refers to as a dispositif. In Foucault's account, discourses create positionalities, interests, positions of power and relations of authority between people, and actors who have an interest in supporting these power relations. Though they are not necessarily created for this purpose, once in place, discourses may generate incentives or strategic logics that work to preserve particular types of power relationship. In Foucault's account, discourses typically come attached to particular techniques, or what he refers to as technologies of government. And he identifies two discursive forms and their associated technologies, which are prevalent in modern societies. The first set of discourses and techniques he identifies are what he calls disciplinary discourses. These are associated with the identification and correction of those agents that are described as deviant or abnormal individuals. Historically, these have included the effeminate homosexual, the hysterical woman, or the criminal type. Disciplinary power in this context works through various techniques, through a decentered network of surveillance, punishment, and rewards for those who depart from or adhere to a specific set of norms. And it's exercised over individuals in an attempt to bring them into line with the norm concerned, much as a gardener might try to train a plant by tying it to a stake. The kind of actors that exercise this sort of power in modern societies are the medical profession, psychiatrists, social workers, these kinds of professional experts. The second set of discourses and technologies that Foucault identifies are what he refers to as biopolitical discourses. Instead of targeting individuals, they target entire populations. The population as a whole is identified in terms of its departure from what are considered to be equilibrium norms or standards. If you like, it's an attempt to identify various disequilibria. For example, reflected in the identification of the prevalence of disease, pollution, or various other kinds of things which are considered in some sense to damage the population as a whole. It can also include things like the rates of smoking, alcohol consumption, obesity, these kind of things which are related to public health. Typically, these discourses are associated with the production of statistics and reports that claim to identify anomalies that need then to be corrected by some kind of intervention or mechanism. The kind of experts who work in this kind of space tend to be public health experts, environmental health experts, and they also include various forms of economic expertise. Biopolitical discourses combine disciplinary mechanisms with what Foucault terms, quite confusingly actually, as security mechanisms. So these mechanisms do not work through commands, rather they govern at a distance through a series of inducements. They could be taxes or subsidies, they could be performance-related pay, they could be requirements to engage in various auditing and regulatory processes. Now, crucially in Foucault's view, he associates these biopolitical discourses and techniques with what he refers to as pastoral power. Biopolitical discourses are a modern form of the kind of power that the church used to exercise over the flock. The church was in charge of guiding the flock, shepherding the flock in the right direction. In today's society, we have various experts who claim to be concerned with the welfare of the population and claim to have the capacity to direct the population in ways that will actually benefit its welfare. This pastoral power typically does not work through issuing of commands or orders. It governs at a distance. It is often facilitated by legislation, but does not govern through legislation. It governs instead by stimulating multiple agents in the social order to deploy disciplinary and biopolitical techniques on other actors and on themselves, and to secure power and position through these deployments. Now, this concept of pastoral power or biopower and the techniques of government that go with it are, I think, the kind of process that can explain some of the threats to freedom that are unfolding in many of today's societies. These are processes that are silently smothering the freedoms we used to associate with a market economy and liberal democracy. How? Well, I would suggest that public discourse in many Western countries has become monopolized by discourses that institutionalize pastoral power and that generate and sustain a set of freedom-threatening tactics or logics. We have come to inhabit a biopolitical dispositive that combines claims to scientific expertise with a focus on positive rights and an ethic of care for the flock or the population, or, crucially, subgroups within the population. Though it is facilitated by sovereign or legislative authority, the resultant power is not exercised directly over actors. It's conducted indirectly through processes of target setting, reporting, and auditing, which are installed in multiple layers of government, but increasingly also in private organizations in response to government-generated incentives. It is these tactics or logics that are generating today's roads to serfdom. And they do so in two ways. The first way is that in this kind of discursive formation or dispositif, individuals and their freedom disappear from view. All that matters are abstract commitments to the welfare of the population, to the community, or to subgroups of communities. Insofar as freedom is referenced at all in these discourses, it's equated with the removal of various pattern anomalies that are considered evidence of some inefficiency or injustice. The state and its satellites, far from being seen to threaten freedom, are constructed as policing the positive outcomes that are required for freedom. These discourses stimulate the demand to control others, to override their freedom, and to demonstrate public commitments to abstract goals. Rather than respect for individual freedom, that freedom must be overridden in the name of freedom or some other objective. A number of examples to illustrate this. Think about public health. We could think about public health in terms of the freedom, the conflicting freedoms of those who smoke and those who don't want to smoke. We could think of it as a kind of dispute resolution process. But that's not what we have in today's discourses about public health. What we have is a focus almost exclusively on targets about the levels of smoking that should be acceptable within a particular society. The focus is on the population level, what is considered to be for the welfare of the population, not the concern about the freedom of the individual, recognizing, of course, that those freedoms can conflict. Multiple organizations involved in public health attempt to gain access to funds and other rewards by demonstrating their commitment to abstract public health goals. Think also about equality, inclusion and diversity initiatives. In many of these initiatives that are focused on social justice, the individuality of the subject isn't really the primary concern. What really matters is how individuals fit or can be fitted into classificatory schemes. The actual experience of a specific person who happens to be gay or black isn't really what matters. What counts is their status is as part of a manageable category. This is why gay people and people of colour who do not espouse views that are supposed to fit their allotted characteristics are frequently silenced or erased from view. Think also discussions about sustainable development and environmental protection. It's not the environment that any individual inhabits that matters in biopolitical discourses today around sustainability. What matters is the attainment of abstract targets and goals that have become attached or associated with the label sustainable development. In all of these examples I've given, the individual agent disappears from view. The focus is on achieving these abstract categories through various managerial techniques or technologies. The second way in which freedom is threatened in this kind of discursive formation is by the stimulation of a decentralized network of policing arrangements that narrow the scope for people to act and even to speak differently. What are the elements of this police and surveillance network? Well, an important part of the network are the pastoral experts who claim to know how to improve the welfare of the population on various dimensions. These experts have incentives to police the truth, because if they didn't police the truth, the source of their expertise would be undermined. Think about public health experts. It's commonplace in many public health fields to close down the range of acceptable opinion. Think about what happened in the pandemic. There were actually a range of views that public health experts have, but only one view came to predominate. And people who didn't subscribe to it were subject to disciplinary power. They were ostracized by other professionals. Why did that take place? Because if you have too many views circulating, then the idea that there are experts who are actually in a position to identify the welfare of the population is undermined. So just in the way that the medieval church sought to block competition from rival religions by having a monopoly, so today's public health pastors try to limit discursive competition within their particular field. The second set of policing agents are various managers in public and private organizations who can gain access to contracts, status, and other sorts of rewards by showing fealty to these abstract categories that are supposed to be commensurate with maximizing the welfare of the population, of social justice, or some other kind of goal. We also have workers within individual organizations who can also gain rewards, promotions, status by showing fealty to the concepts that are being propagated by the various experts. So there are rewards to these actors from policing other people's conduct and from imposing the discipline on themselves. We also have pressure groups acting outside of organizations, lobbying to say whether or not people are departing from what the approved courses of action may be. And many people within organizations and at various levels of government then submit, if you like, to the disciplinary power that is being exercised by these various interest groups who attempt to colonize particular areas of public policy. Now, what I'm describing here is, if you like, a micro-level or decentralized version of the why the worst get to the top dynamic, operating in multiple different fields. The people who are the experts in these fields are not dictators, okay, in the form of a Lenin, a Stalin, or a Mao, but they are what I would describe as ruthless agenda setters, and people who can gain power and position from setting agendas and setting and train a whole set of processes that then lead to the policing, surveillance, and disciplining of other actors. This is happening in multiple fields where you have an alignment between legislative decisions, discourses, and various surveillance techniques or management processes that are operating through the political economy. I want to give just 3 examples to illustrate this. Think about the requirements that the Bank of England is now introducing for those firms that it regulates to have sustainability plans or equality, inclusion, and diversity plans. If you don't have such a plan in place, if you don't have a set of procedures or targets in place, then you may face regulatory penalties. Think about what is happening in universities. Organisations like UKRI exercise this kind of power. If you put in a research application that doesn't make some reference to something like sustainable development or EDI or whatever it may be, the chances are you're not going to get any funding. To get funding, you can still get it if you disagree with some of these ideas, but you have to use the language that they use. You have to talk about EDI or sustainability. And what does that do? In Foucauldian terms, it reproduces the discourse. It reproduces the very policing system that is, if you like, causing the problem in the first place. Now, the key thing here, I think, from a Hayekian perspective, is none of these schemes are likely to work, okay, in the sense that they're not likely to work to produce the outcomes they claim to want to do. But what they do is institute this whole network of surveillance and policing, which closes down people's space to exercise their freedom to be self-governing agents. It's precisely because it operates silently and insidiously that this kind of threat may be even more pronounced than the one that Hayek enunciated in that great book, The Road to Serfdom. Thank you very much.